Good morning from Ghana. Good morning from Kumasi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clifford, for agreeing to do this and making time every morning in Ghana to be part of our InfUr seminar series. And thank you everyone here and online for joining in today. Before we commence today's seminar, I would like to pay our respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we have gathered today, and honor them for their contribution to the academia, and also to acknowledge their contribution in future studies as well. So for today, we have Professor Amoako, who's our full professor, was just came in, the news just came in. So he's no more an associate professor, but a full professor of urban planning, joining us today. And Clifford has been a very good friend of mine. He's been my teacher, he's been my mentor. He actually provided supervision for my honors thesis in 2008, and later became a colleague, and I have worked with him for some time now. So I'm really pleased to have him join us today. He is full professor now of urban planning. He did his PhD in human geography and planning from Monash University, and he has published widely on issues of informality in Ghana and across Africa. And he has also consulted widely for international organizations operating in Africa. So without much ado, I welcome Clifford, who is going to present to us on the foundations of African urbanism, focusing on informality. Thank you so much, Clifford, for joining me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm so grateful for the honor and the opportunity.
Please, you are muted.
I think Victor's going to try.
Oh,
okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm honored to be here this morning to be part of a presentation that will be sharing just a few of my thoughts to giants in the topic, students, and people interested in and passionate about African urbanism. Let me share the screen. I hope all of you can see my screen now.
Yes, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Whilst preparing for this morning's presentation, at least this morning from here, I was just telling myself that West Africa is waking up, just waking up to a day which has already been largely decided on other parts of the world. And I was asking myself, can the sub-region catch up? And if it will catch up, what are the resources to do so? My presentation is not going to answer these questions, but in a way, it has bothered me this morning. And I think that maybe as we discuss further, we will find answers to that. On my presentation itself, I hope that I can capture your attention on a few thoughts. First, with some contextual dilemma I have as an African planner speaking about informality. And that has been my major trajectory in terms of understanding informality since I started studying it. And then I will look at how Africa's identity can be synonymous to informality and why we keep planning against it. And then I will also share a few thoughts on how Africa's urbanism has been shaped by informality. Then I can suggest a few thoughts in repositioning the discourse with a few entry points. So this is a photo of central Kumasi, the city where I live and work. It's a drone photo I took when the colored structure on your left was built. It is called the KJTR multi-purpose market and transport terminal. And there were many, should I say, protests by the original market women market traders who felt that the city government has gotten some money from the government of Brazil and is trying to build this edifice to dislocate them and bring in their favorites and other Chinese companies and other foreign companies. And there were several protests. So whilst working on that project, I got a drone to take this photo. That tells you the dichotomy of the African urbanism, where you question how the city is planned and who the city is planned for. But on the more serious contextual dilemma, I will say that I am speaking this morning from the position of an African, also living in Africa. And therefore, informality for me is what I have always known, what I have always seen and participated in, because I have also sold items in the streets in a small community in Ghana before. So I find informality as a cultural identity of who we are, how we connect daily and build community in our societies. It is our everyday urban practice, selling and buying, exchanging greetings, pleasantries, discussing family, and essentially encouraging ourselves. In some cases, it is also a way by which we resist oppression, sometimes from the state, sometimes coping with the multiple realities of daily living. So essentially, for me as an African speaking from West Africa, participation and contributing to urban functioning is an everyday thing that every African is doing. The question is, who is not doing anywhere in the world? But how is it defined? So that is one side of the dilemma, the contextual dilemma, as in, must I be studying what I do always? And why is it that intellectually important to study what I do always? That is one side. Then the other side is speaking also from Africa as an urban planner. I was taught as a student, and now I am teaching in the planning school to see informality as a disorder in the urban structure. In fact, I have actually taught some of my students as to how to deal with informality, and unfortunately, is dealing with it as an unapproved urban space, which is not fitting into the structure and beauty of the city. In some cases, we term them illegitimate and illegal. And many of our products who are practicing as planners across the Anglophone African countries actually will go for demolition, forced eviction, and other such brutal interventions. We have seen them as places and activities that are supposed to be taken out of the urban structure to ensure the aesthetics and the beauty of the city. A story is told in Ghana in the late 90s when they organized the Non-Aligned Movement Conference, the NAM conference. And the government had issued an order that all roaming, mad people roaming the streets, all structures that are unpalatable should be taken away because we are about to receive visitors. And so this was an approach to clean the city of whatever it is that we define as informality. So essentially, these are the two conceptual dilemmas I have. Having to study only to uproot what I have always known. So that's where I come from in terms of my understanding of informality, that whatever I know has been, I have now been taught to see it as a disorder, see it as unapproved, see it as illegitimate, and also see it as places to be taken out of the urban structure so that it will be beautiful. So whatever I have known, done, seen my entire life is no more beautiful, and that the city I will learn to plan should be looking at, should be looking different from what I have always seen. Okay, so then we come to talk about the African urban identity. Having established that the informality is everything we do every day and how we face realities in Africa, why then should it be an issue? Then the story of cats, arguably the beginning of this informality discussion, coincidentally happened in Accra, Ghana. The story is told of a hat's observation of northern migrants, who are migrants from the northern part of Ghana, who he found in Accra, working in a sector he termed informal sector. But in reality, that was what has always been. But the informal sector was defined or identified, if I should say. And he had two questions. One is to look at the nature of that sector and to find out whether it is either not being exploited by the so-called formal sector, and on the other hand, whether it has that capacity to be able to survive. He went into trying to look at the typologies of informal economic activities and categorizing them as legitimate or illegitimate. So that started the conversation. So I would say informality has now been defined, categorized, but sadly at some point problematized. So the question is this discovered, described, or narrated? Well, I think that it is all discovered, described, narrated as well, depending on what one looks at. But in the broader urban literature following Keith Hart, informality is conceptualized as manifestations of and responses to urban inequality, rapid urbanization, spatial fragmentation, and so on. The late Watson did a lot of work on that. In some parts, we are also looking at informality as a product of the inadequacies of formality or structure, and so on. So once again, the broad discussions about informality when it comes to the African literature has been looking at it from a problematized point, and also looking at it also on the other side as an everyday practice of residents that clashes with state vision and plans. And that's where I want to quickly say that if the everyday lives of urban residents clashes with the state's vision and plan, then the question is, what is the vision of the state? Because a good vision of the state should rather look at and incorporate the everyday lives of urban residents. So that once again presents an interested personality with this dilemma again, that if the entire informality thinking is to, is to find, is to look at the dichotomy between what everyday people are doing and what the state's vision or state plan is, then obviously somebody should shift or one should shift. And we will see why the shifting has been so difficult. In terms of perspectives, a number of perspectives have been discussed. The spatial aspect of informality is discussed broadly to look at places which we have always looked at as unapproved. In fact, for planners in Africa, especially Anglophone Africa, essentially places that are to be evicted, displaced, and so on. And then there are economic activities not known, not registered within the state systems. So in the streets of Africa, West Africa mainly, you have a lot of economic activities that the urban state claims does not know. Then there are social aspects, they are legal, political, but all these are happening at the same time, and that's the melting pot of the African urbanism that gives the identity. So anytime you talk about African urban discussions, then we are looking at a huge aspect of the city, not known spatially, not registered economically, socially disconnected from the state systems, legally not under the governance structure and operating. Interestingly, that is also accommodating majority, an average of about 67% of the urban population in Anglophone Africa are within this sector. So, what therefore is this place within the African urbanism discussion? Where is the place? And I have chosen for this presentation, choosing for us to look at a little bit of the impact of the colonial trajectory of Anglophone Africa mainly, but it was similar across the West African sub-region. What was it, and what has been the place, and how can that help us understand informality from the African perspective? So the question I ask is, what was it? What was the African urbanism like before colonialism, or before the entry of the West into Africa, or West Africa? What was urbanism? For this purpose of this discussion, I'll say that the urbanism was started with the reports of kingdoms, so, if you like, stronger kingdoms that created trade hubs, that engineered a lot of economic interactions across the continent, especially in the sub-Saharan part of the continent, were recorded. So there was some amount of urbanism, which was hinged on powers and structures of kingdoms trade, and economic interactions. Then there were reports of emergence of port towns, especially along the West African coast, that was also engaging in trading. And so once again, economic, trade, and movements of people. There were then the coming in of missionaries and who later became colonialists, who saw, and some described what they saw as well laid out and sophisticated for the purpose of the time. But others also described it this way. So there are two descriptions largely, which I have highlighted in red. So highlighted in red, one given by Stanley, who says what he saw in Accra is compact mass of thatched buildings arranged in a haphazard manner and separated by narrow, crooked streets. Compact mass of thatched buildings arranged in a haphazard manner and separated by narrow, crooked streets. That's the description of one person. There are others who saw it as formally unplanned, but meaningfully ordered physical structures to settlements largely respecting traditionally established arrangements and ways of life. So we can look at the African urbanism from these two angles. Who saw it as compact, mass, arranged haphazardly, and separated by crooked, narrow streets. Or formally unplanned, but meaningfully ordered physical structure that was respecting traditionally established arrangements and ways of life. So the dichotomy starts. And that dichotomy is what has existed till today. And we will talk more about that. The question of who is seeing the African city, or who is seeing African urbanism, who is describing it, and what is that observer seeing? And I think that's where the dichotomy has always been. So then we have to look at making the city. Is it crooked roads and, if you like, mass of thatched buildings, or meaningfully structured neighborhoods that respect traditional way of life, all that? So that's where we started from. So African urbanism started with places of trade, informal trade between indigenous empires and European traders. And at the time, it was okay to trade informally and do business and still establish communities and kingdoms. And there were also places of existing customary powers, which I've already mentioned, with natural resources and economic potentials that invited traders from different parts of the world. And then because of this, they became places of coexistence between European traders and locals. So that is where we started from. So Kobo and Chapel in 1995 suggested that there were main urban settlements that were found in the functions as trade zones and political centers for tribal empires. So the African urbanism has always been there. The problem has been the definition, structure, and the picture needed to be seen. Then colonialism came between the 1800s and mid 1900s. especially in West Africa, under colonial domination. There was a number of initial manifestations of colonial rule that shaped the story around urbanization and urbanism in Africa. First is castles, the building of castles as citadels for colonial governance, and establishment of capitals and commercial cities across the West Africa sub-region. You can talk about Accra, Kumasi, Lagos, Abidjan, Kano, and all that, Dakar. Then construction of network infrastructure, roads and railways that connected resourceful parts of the countries or the emerging colonies, if I should say, to the ports. And a key approach to governance at the time was indirect rule, which made use of informal systems and structures for political and economic gain. Why? Because though unwritten, the systems were efficient and fit for purpose. So obviously, it had been used before. Informality, in this case, was beneficial for political and economic stability of the colonies, and also to the advantage of the metropolitan countries that had colonized that. So it was okay to have a dichotomous internal structure of towns and cities, where in the literature in West Africa, we have European areas and indigenous neighborhoods for most of the emerging colonial African cities. So the internal structure showed that there were places for European neighborhoods and indigenous neighborhoods, and they lived together for the purposes of establishing the colonial interest and also making use of the resources available. So in the frame of colonial urbanism, Grant and Youngson had this internal structure described for most of the emerging African cities. There were areas of colonial administration, buildings, and military bases, usually close to the ports. The warehouses and railway terminals and other functions of trade and storage and distribution were there. Adjacent to that was the European well-defined central business district that served as the headquarters of major foreign companies, and they followed zoning codes. And then there were also area demarcated for European residences also near the CBD. And then we had existing unplanned indigenous areas, some of which resisted colonial imposed planning, but ordered to reflect indigenous way of life. And then there are other indigenous areas that were markets for indigenous people and all that. So essentially, that's where the African urbanism started taking shape, where there's that dichotomous, or if you like, overlaps of spatial order representing the times, representing the ideas, and representing the functions of the period. So essentially, that's how the colonial African urbanism started. And it hasn't changed much. We will see later, it hasn't changed much. Right, so then we have established the African urbanism from the perspective of having these different interests displayed spatially and functioning to give meaning to both an emerging African and a colonial direction. So these are the two. Later on, you see the emergence of land use planning and zoning codes. That was in the 1940s and 50s, and they were characterized by introduction of health and town planning ordinances. And these were actually shipped, I would say, from the colonial West to the colonies. So a story is told of this colonial secretary, Lord Pasfield, who said, "I have the honor to inform you that I have recently been giving consideration to the question of town and regional planning in the colonies. And as a result, the English Planning Acts were activated across the West African sub-region. So for the colonies in West Africa, we're talking about Nigeria, the Gold Coast, then now Ghana, and Sierra Leone and Gambia between 1945 to 1946, right down to 1951, the entire place had been saturated with ordinances. Now, the ordinances also came with an attempt to get land for the crown, the British crown. And it happened that for many of these colonial systems, there were rejection, wild rejection of planning, of the ordinances and so on. So then the dichotomy started. So you see that at this level of African urbanism story or trajectory, you see planning being introduced not as a way of life of the people, but as a colonial tool to either structure, oppress, or redirect urbanism at the time. And the resistance were natural, and that created the dichotomy we are dealing with now. So we have modernity as a way of colonial direction, and we also have resistance and a little bit of compliance, a little bit of compromise of the indigenous people, and that shaped the African urbanism when it comes to informality. So in the West African side, we see there were well-managed town planning ordinances where the part of the colony has plans, structures, and all that, whereas other parts of the city has no plan, and all that. So sitting together. South African cities were even more rigidly segregated, and they call them apartheid cities, where there's one area of planning that is for the colonialists, and then sometimes separated with a buffer, and then the other areas are called the neighborhoods or the slum areas and so on and so forth. So the African urbanism story also has a racial part that has not been told, or that has been told but not discussed. So and that led to total protests of various kinds. And in South Africa, we have a lot of stories of many Boer wars and all that. So that side of the African urbanism was also supposed to be noted. Now, due to the death and control of colonialism and the associated resistance, most emerging Anglophone African cities, as I said, could be described again as one, European residential areas with their luxurious homes, race courses, golf, polo club, and all that. And then indigenous neighborhoods with unplanned but structured patterns to reflect communal way of life and livelihood practices. That's what you see as the African urbanism. But the interesting part of it is this, that the people living in the European residential areas, luxurious homes, needed people from the indigenous neighborhood to clean their homes, to fix their taps and a few other things. So these two either dichotomous or overlapping spaces have always defined the African urbanism. So the African urbanism is defined by beautiful residential areas that need the support of indigenous unplanned areas of a kind, and vice versa, because these indigenous neighborhoods also see these residential areas as their places of work. And so the urbanism is always like this. And that has shaped the thinking of the informality. So the place of informality is that it is that which builds the city, but stays at the periphery of the city. Then the struggle of independence. The struggle of independence started when the African recognized that there's a lot more he can get from colonial rule. So the causes of independence struggle were myriad and varied, but it's important to note that the dichotomous urban structures mentioned earlier was one of that. The revolt was against land, housing, and rent-related taxes and discrimination. So dichotomy that we mentioned was also a major source of the independence struggle. So because of poor living conditions of the people living next door, that was compared to the very good living conditions of the other people next door, created enmity, created anger, and then the revolt. So the infamous 28th February 1948 protest in Accra that led to Ghana's independence, or later Ghana's independence, was described as a peaceful demonstration marching from Jamestown, which was the traditional part of the city, the neighborhood, to Christiansborg Castle, which was the European stronghold and neighborhood. That means it was a contention between two neighborhoods of frustration and authority. So we look at the beginning of Africa's independence also as a clash between informality and so-called formality, where people in the neighborhoods felt cheated and poorly treated, and therefore moved into the good areas to call for justice, call for equity, and other things. Sadly, a number of people were killed, and that started the revolt, which brought Ghana's independence in 1957 as the first sub-Saharan African to gain independence from British colonial rule, and then triggered other revolts across, especially the Anglophone West African sub-region, where the revolt was there. So at this point, I want to bring our minds back to the place of informality in shaping the independence struggle, and also in trying to explain that informality and how it has been dealt with or not dealt with has actually had a lot more impact in the governance structure of African societies than we have discussed. And that's what I wanted to bring to our notice for discussion. The struggle continued, and there were a lot of urban twists to the independence struggle, because there was massive urbanization, because the emerging African elites needed rural populations to help them revolt. So massive movement from the rural areas to the urban area was a key part of the independence struggle. And attacks, same people, attacks on European CBDs and residential areas were all protests in colonial cities. So I would say that Africa's independence struggle was urban. African independence struggle was urban because that was where the impact could be felt. And the organized, educated elites, African urbanized elites, used the support of rural migrants who later were found to be in Keith Haas' work, the ones who were working as informal sector. But they were the pioneers of the struggle. The people moved from the villages, used to move or to fight for political freedom or political independence, but later became the informal sector in the 60s and the 70s. So rapid urbanization actually was seen as the most dramatic social phenomenon that marked the end of colonialism, i.e. the trooping of the people from the hinterlands was a scare, and it was quite overwhelming, and that pushed colonialism away. So once again, the story of African urbanism can be told using the colonial struggle or the independence struggle lens as a factor. Independence is here, and the urban areas were responding. The political independence started in the late 50s for Ghana, and then 60s for Nigeria and the other African, Anglo-African, and much later for the Southern Anglo-African countries. But the situation was generally the same, where now the indigenous elites have taken over from colonial government, and they were working with customary leadership and taking over European functions, which is governance, security, and business. Interestingly, not too much changed, even though there were de-Europeanization and nationalization of the economy. Also, all direct state ownership of corporations and businesses brought in more labor. And then infrastructure, not that. So then the urban function started expanding. But the dichotomy remained. So the places taken over by educated elites and their traditional structured counterparts remained, whilst the emerging neighborhoods also remained. So not much changed. There were expansions of indigenous markets, native enterprises, which was giving a lot more room for informal spaces and activities to expand. And then the entrenchment of governance by the new independent government, which were now local people and traditional authorities. But the dichotomy, spatial dichotomy, remained. Spatial dichotomy remained. So even though we have a lot more happening at independence, the dichotomy of having a state-managed areas handled by local leaders as against unplanned neighborhoods that made it difficult for any expansion and, if you like, changes in the urban functions. So it did not take too long, and there were revolts again. So most newly independent African countries had their first coup in the first 10 years. Most African countries, for example, Ghana had independence somewhere in 1957, and by 1966, there was an overthrow. The case of Nigeria, I think somewhere around 1960s, and by 1966, January, there was an overthrow. So essentially, the independence struggle did not change much because the dichotomy was there. And once the dichotomy, even though it was closing up because people started seeing themselves as the same, as in, okay, we still have Black leaders and we also have ourselves here, but because the dichotomy was not bridged, and it appeared that the new independent governments were also entrenching the positioning and the posture of the colonial government. It led to many, many, many challenges because the dichotomy was still there. So by 1960s, all early independence Anglophone African countries had their first schools. And the urban twist to this is that the governments were accused of neo-colonial tendencies, which means that they were basically continuing the dichotomy of having one planned area and one poor area. Urban infrastructure were destroyed. Yes.
We have 5 minutes remaining.
Wow.
Thank
so
you.
Sorry about that. Okay. Right. So then I'll rush us through to see. Okay. So I want to say that for this story is basically saying that the African urbanism story started as a cultural identity and use of physical spaces, which is everyday lifestyle. Colonialism now redefined it to make it living against established norms. And then the formation of the African state looked at it as an alternative to the state vision, still establishing the dichotomy. Modernization now makes it a nuisance that must be removed. And in moving at the future, we are looking at working towards millennial cities without informality. And the question is that the reality? We're still 67% of the people living in informal spaces and over 80% employed in informal sectors, while we're planning work against the majority and working towards losing the African identity. Why must that be? So these are questions that the African urbanism discussion around informality will raise. So if we want to reposition their discourse, we have to see the African urbanism trajectory as a way of the snake removing its skin. The process is a stage process, attempting to change, but only growing in dimensions and shedding old skin. And I believe that we can look at it again using four major entry points. One, I'll call knowledge. I think that we should begin to approach the problematized and dichotomous narrative and look at informality access and take a deeper look at the African urbanism theory, i.e. to have an urbanism theory, because those of us who studied in planning schools didn't see the African urbanism theory. We might have to contribute into building it and be able to see how best we can place and position the African urbanism theory with informality properly placed. And that will come from these three other words I have here. One is recognition. Recognizing that the innate nature of informality or the innate nature of informality to African urbanism is there. Its evolution, its expansion, typologies, roles, and challenges must be clear. Sometimes we look at informality from a very broad perspective, but it is important to note that it has all forms, and every single day you wake up in Africa, you see a new form of informality every single day. And those of us studying informality and we are in Africa, it's something that is so dynamic, you can't simply hold it at any time. But it's also important that after recognizing, we accept that it can be legitimate and it can be part of this engine that will propel Africa's urbanism. One of the slides I've skipped, I have spoken about how we can actually make it possible, or how we can discuss the best way of using it. And then I think that if we have recognized it, accepted it, then planning education, planning regulation, planning interventions can actually begin to include informality as a key part of African urbanism. And I'm very elated that the discussion is building and is bigger and is becoming more entrenched. And I'm sure today's discussion will also bring out some of the issues that I haven't mentioned. So in order to round up, I will share a few thank yous. I will say that I'm very grateful to Professor Kwame, a very good friend and a very, very wonderful academic, for making me have this opportunity. I don't take it for granted at all. I'm very, very grateful. And the organizers of the seminar, the School of Design, and your Research Hub, I thank you so much for the opportunity. And all the academics and scholars who have led the way to this discourse. They have kickstarted something that is going to take a long while to finish. I believe that the informality discussion will continue because there cannot be African urbanism without informality. I also want to thank all the audience for joining from near and far, especially those of us in West Africa who are just waking up. It means that you have been up for a very long time, and I'm very, very grateful. I also want to thank my department for the opportunity that I've been given. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Clifford, for a very interesting presentation. We still have a few minutes left, and the intention is to get at least 3 questions. So probably I will kickstart it. I mean, I really enjoy your presentation demonstrating that informality is the bedrock of the African urbanism and that it has become our culture. That is very true. And you also went further to highlight knowledge as one of the key entry points in terms of understanding informality as the basis upon which African urbanism occurs. So at what point, I mean, given that in your introductory remark, you indicated that even as of today, the planning schools in Africa are still teaching the Western-inspired ideologies instead of recognizing that this is our culture and this is how we have to frame it to address the problem that really confront us. Given that you are within the planning school framework, how do you intend, or through your research, intend to change this narrative so that we train graduates or we train planners who have the understanding of the African context and try to address problems facing African cities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Patrick. I will answer my question by this statement. I'll start with this statement that the full impact of colonialism has not been understood. The full impact of colonialism on education in Africa has not been fully uprooted and properly unpacked. So I thank you that you have brought this up. I did a presentation, I think you were there, I'm sure. I did a presentation in our department one day where I was talking about the construction of footbridges in Africa. I mean, most footbridges in Africa have a lot of informal activities around. And I was saying that looking at who we are, there should be a new design for the African footbridge because we interact more. And this is how we want us. In fact, immediately after the presentation, one professor in our department asked, are we allowing chaos? Clearly to tell you that there's going to be a long time of relearning and relearning again. And I have seen many works of the late Vanessa Watson, Abdul Malik, and trying to push in this important agenda of looking at the Southern theory or the African urbanism theory. So I think that I would say it has started already before me. We are still pushing, but the next level will be a curriculum change. The next level will be change. And I think that you will even be very instrumental because you happen to be an African planner living in the West. So your contributions are also very, very, very important. And we are actually feeling the impact. A lot of your works are redirecting the thoughts. So I know that eventually we'll get there, but it's going to be a slow and painful process, a very slow and painful process, almost the same as the colonial process that I bored you with this morning.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate. Before we come to those in the room, Femi online, do you have a question? I've seen that you put something on in the chat. Do you want to ask that question, Femi? Femi, are you there? Okay. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes, please.
Thank you, Patrick.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah. No, not really a question, but just reflecting on what Clifford said in terms of coloniality of informality. I mean, it's still entrenched in development thinking, even from the political class, even within the education system. So it's still entrenched. So it's a kind of ongoing discussion. Of course, there are some African scholars that are coming up now, really challenging this, but it's a very complex situation, really, honestly. So not really a question, but just alluding to that. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Clifford. So my question is more along this historical narration that you've presented, because a lot of literature that we have been looking at coming from South Asian subcontinent about colonial urbanism, and they have been, as a state, as an upholder of formality, they have been trying to counter that. So this indigenous and European, formal, informal, that kind of dichotomy has been there. For example, Chaturpadhyay talks about emergent forms, which are where already actors from indigenous classes were present in the part of planning, and also municipal trust moving to improvement trust as a capitalist organizations within South Asian subcontinent during the British rule. I'm wondering if that was the case in the African history as well, or if, as you say, the dichotomy was very much segmented, it was actually indigenous, European, formal, informal.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. Didn't get quite part of your question, but what I gather is this: that was there a dichotomy in the building up? But my answer would be this. It isn't actually dichotomous. It is an overlap, which from time to time is presented as a dichotomy. So the African city, for example, if you look at the informality as economic activities, the question is, who are patronizing these economic activities? Obviously, people from the so-called planned areas also patronize economic activities in the informal sector. As I was saying, that if you look at a very planned neighborhood, you get the sense that, okay, this is a planned neighborhood, everything works very well. But if they need, say, carpenters, they need plumbers and so on, they get them from the informal neighborhoods. So it is dichotomous intellectually in terms of discussion, but operationally, it is an overlap. And that is what it requires our recognition, acceptance, and therefore inclusion. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you so much, Clifford. Our time is up, but I will be happy to have one more question if anyone has a question.
I think there was a hand up by some. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Professor Amoako. So I do political urbanism in the University of Bern, Switzerland. And for me, my research interest is always spatial planning, what are the possibilities of spatial planning in addressing this problem. And because most of the literature that problematizes informality is within the planning literature. So I'm wondering, is a solely or purely spatial planning approach enough to address this problem of problematizing informality? Because we speak of complex land tenure systems, which for me becomes a problem of land policy, like the broader discussion is land policy rather than just spatial planning. So I don't know the potential of planning alone in addressing this problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Share some insights about it.
Yes. Thank you very much. Planning is hugely limited in addressing this problem. Planning can only present a two-dimensional aspect of it. But there are institutional, as you have already mentioned, institutional, there are sociological parts of it, there are infrastructure part, and quite a wide range. So I would say that planning is hugely limited in dealing with this issue. The presentation appeared to have skewed it because I'm coming from that background. But obviously, planning is hugely limited and cannot resolve this. It's a whole huge global, if you should look at it from a very global point of view, to have a sociological aspect. And you remember one of my slides looked at 5 or 6 perspectives. There's the economic, there's the social, there's the legal, there's the political, and so on. So planning is hugely limited when it comes to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clifford. Mendelson, is that how you pronounce your name? Sorry if I got it wrong. Do you like to read out a question? Last question? Okay, probably she puts a question there. Maybe she will get in touch with you later.
Okay.
It's not working. Okay, so the person writes, this is a great talk. How do you think in practice would a top-bottom governance system change in Africa to allow a new governance system that accepts the way the African city actually work?
Yes, thank you very much. I would say that for more, since independence, the struggle for recognition has been there, and it continues. It is continuing, and all that. So I'm seeing a gradual shift towards accepting that the urban residents also have a say in planning. So even though planning education and planning practice in Africa have not changed much, the urban state government is beginning to appreciate the fact that the urbanites are part of the planning process. So I see a gradual shift operationally in terms of building participatory systems of urban governance. I see that operational change, but I haven't seen much in terms of legal structures, institutional structures, and planning education. So I would say that it will take a bit of time for institutional structures, planning education, legal structures to change. But operationally, there is some amount of shift towards bringing in informality. So that's what I would say for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clifford. The questions keep coming, but we just have to conclude this conversation. So I would like to say a big thank you to Clifford, who had to wake up at probably dawn time to get this presentation done to us. So we are really grateful for your time and the intellectual discussion that you have led this afternoon here. And I would encourage everyone to support me in thanking Clifford with a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
And again, thank you to everyone here in person and our huge online presence. We really appreciate your coming in and for contributing to the discussion as well. Thank you so much. And Clifford, have a good day. Thank you.